Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Saddam Hussein was captured Saturday, December 13th at about 8:30 p.m. local in a cellar in the town of Ad-Duar, which is about 15 kilometers south of Tikrit. This is a great day in Iraq's history.
That stunning announcement early this morning from Paul Bremer, U.S. Administrator for Iraq. I'm Ed Bradley. Tonight on 60 Minutes, how they got him, from Pentagon correspondent David Martin, what Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has to say about it in a conversation with Leslie Stahl, and another look at Dan Rather's interview with Saddam Hussein shortly before the war began. Those stories, Andy Rooney, and more about the events in Iraq tonight on this special edition of 60 Minutes. In spite of extraordinary coalition efforts and a $25 million price on his head, Saddam Hussein was able to evade capture for 8 months. How American forces finally arrived at the place where Saddam was literally holed up, tonight from CBS News national security correspondent David Martin.
Saddam Hussein was literally run to ground, cornered and found hiding at the bottom of a small hole. The man who had defied the world, terrorized his own country, and frustrated American attempts to kill him, gave up without a fight. As J. Paul Bremer, the head of the American occupation of Iraq, put it, the tyrant is a prisoner.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Saddam Hussein was captured Saturday, December 13th at about 8:30 p.m. local in a cellar in the town of Ad-Duar, which is about 15 kilometers south of Tikrit.
At the end, he was dirty, disheveled, unshaven, and virtually alone.
He was in the bottom of a hole, so there's no way he could fight back, so he was just caught like a rat.
General Ray Odierno, commander of the troops who made the capture, said Saddam had a pistol, but didn't use it. Once in custody, the man who wielded power over millions meekly submitted to doctors' orders. Seeming bewildered and disoriented, he looked to General Ricardo Sanchez, the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, like a man who had reached the end of his tether.
He was a tired man, and also, I think, a man resigned to his fate.
Guarding against the possibility they had captured a body double, specialists made a positive identification based on a tattoo and old bullet wounds from a long-ago assassination attempt. Other former members of his regime already in custody, like Tariq Aziz, identified him. And even Saddam himself acknowledged the Americans had the right man.
He was cooperative during the process of being brought into our detention facilities and in the process of being given his medical examinations last night.
General Odierno's 4th Infantry Division had been on the hunt for Saddam and his inner circle for months, conducting raid after raid in and around his hometown of Tikrit. But the break they were looking for did not come until intelligence analysts dug into their files and came up with a list of bodyguards and cronies who might still be with Saddam or know where he was. American troops set out to bring them in.
As we continue to conduct raids and capture people, we got more and more information on the families that were somewhat close to Saddam Hussein. Over the last 10 days or so, we brought in about 5 to 10 members of these families who then were able to give us even more information. And finally, we got the ultimate information from one of these individuals.
That ultimate information pointed to a pair of farmhouses where the prisoner said one of Saddam's bodyguards and even the man himself might be hiding.
At about 10:50 hours yesterday, we received intelligence on the possible whereabouts of Saddam Hussein. 2 likely locations were identified near the town of Ad-Duar.
In an operation codenamed Red Dawn, the 4th Infantry Division, along with Special Operations Forces, sent out 600 troops to surround the 2 houses, located across the Tigris River from one of Saddam's palace complexes. 7 hours later, they were ready to pounce.
Under the cover of darkness and with lightning speed, the Raider Brigade's forces were positioned and began movement toward the objectives northwest of Ad-Duar.
2 hours later, they moved in. At first, it looked like a repeat of so many raids before. Close, but no Saddam.
Coalition forces assaulted the 2 objectives, but initially did not find the target.
The troops fanned out through the compound and came upon a small shed. Inside, they uncovered a hole hidden under a styrofoam lid.
There was an insert that was made of styrofoam, so it was very light to pick up out of the hole. And on top of that was a rug. And then below that was, in fact, the hole, as you see there. It was a very narrow hole that was not very big at all.
A hole so small, General Sanchez called it a spider hole.
After uncovering the spider hole, a search was conducted, and Saddam Hussein was found hiding at the bottom of the hole. The spider hole is about 6 to 8 feet deep and allows enough space for a person to lie down inside of it.
The hole had an air vent to allow Saddam to breathe, but with no place to run, he surrendered, almost in the shadow of some of the palaces that had once been symbols of his power.
You could just about see some of these palace complexes from there, and I think it's rather ironic that he was in a hole in the ground across the river from these great palaces that he's built, where he robbed all the money from the Iraqi people.
Troops found $750,000, but otherwise the compound was as ordinary as his palaces were grandiose, which probably explains why Odierno's troops had not bothered to search it earlier in their months-long hunt for Saddam.
We have been to this area before. We have been down this road before. That doesn't mean he's been there the whole time. My guess would be he has probably 20 to 30 of these all around the country that he moved around.
For 8 months, Saddam had managed to stay just a step ahead of the American war machine. On the opening night of the war, the Air Force and Navy bombed a palace complex on the outskirts of Baghdad, where a spy said Saddam was spending the night. When we visited the complex last spring, we found that bombs and cruise missiles had destroyed several buildings, but the main palace had not taken a direct hit.
You can believe, at least I can believe, that a person that was in this house
could have survived. Oh, yes, sir.
could have survived.
Sure.
The day after the raid, Saddam showed up on television, as he would several times during the war. As U.S. troops closed in on Baghdad, a B-1 bomber struck a restaurant where he was reported to have been spotted. The target was destroyed, the occupants killed, but the people in the neighborhood said Saddam wasn't there when the bombs hit. He made one last appearance on television. The same day, U.S. Marines were helping Iraqis tear down one of his statues. And then he disappeared, surfacing only in the form of poor-quality audio tapes exhorting the Iraqi people to throw out the American invaders. He made one of those tapes shortly after his two sons, Uday and Qusay, were killed last July. Did he know then that when his turn came, he would not fight to the end but surrender? The Iraqi who told the Americans where they could find Uday and Qusay was paid a $30 million reward, $15 million for each, and whisked out of the country. Saddam had a price of $25 million on his head, but no tipster ever came forward, leaving American troops always one step behind their moving target.
I've said from the beginning, I believe he moves every 3 to 4 hours and very short notice, and I believe he moved probably to several locations such as this.
The U.S. formed a special team of commandos known as Task Force 121, but Saddam traveled with no entourage and never used cell phones, giving up the trappings of power to blend into the landscape.
If you see where we found him, he could have been hiding in 100 different places, 1,000 different places like this all around Iraq. And it just takes finding the right person who will give you a good idea where he might be. And that's what happened today, last night.
There were several occasions on which officials thought they had missed the man they called the Ace of Spades by just minutes or hours. But they could never be sure, and besides, close didn't count. Even with Saddam in custody, the president knows the war in Iraq is not over.
The capture of Saddam Hussein does not mean the end of violence in Iraq. We still face terrorists who would rather go on killing the innocent than accept the rise of liberty in the heart of the Middle East. Such men are a direct threat to the American people, and they will be defeated.
But there's no denying his capture is a turning point. As long as Saddam was on the loose, U.S. officials could never say with conviction what can now be said with certainty.
We now have final resolution. Saddam Hussein will never return to a position of power from which he can punish, terrorize, intimidate, and exploit the Iraqi people as he did for more than 35 years. The chapter of Iraq's history that was filled with Saddam Hussein's reign of terror is now closed forever.
But the questioning of Saddam about his reign of terror is just beginning. He has already undergone his initial interrogation, and officials say he revealed nothing of consequence, sticking to the same story he told before the war. Eventually, officials say he will be turned over to the Iraqis to be tried as a war criminal.
The first word the president got that U.S. forces believe they had Saddam in custody, he got from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Now, Leslie Stahl and Secretary Rumsfeld on what the capture of Saddam Hussein means for the future of the American presence in Iraq and what it also means for the Iraqi people.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I guess the big question today is, does the capture of Saddam Hussein now mean mission accomplished?
Well, certainly not. The goal with respect to Iraq is to assist that country in assuming sovereignty and to assume the responsibility for its own security and to see it on a path of economic recovery. A nation that is whole, that is at peace with its neighbors, and is respectful of the various ethnic and religious elements within the country. That's the goal. That's the path we're on. Certainly the capture of Saddam Hussein is important. It's important because he was a vicious dictator. He killed tens of thousands of people. He tortured people. He used gas on his own people. And the fear factor, as long as he was loose and people could imagine that he conceivably could come back and repress them once again, the fear factor was sizable. So it is an important step along the way, but clearly there are challenges ahead.
The president said today that he did not expect this capture to end the violence. And I've actually heard people suggest that the violence might even increase. I mean, what is the significance really of the capture? What does it change?
It changes what I just said it changes. It takes away the fear that this man could conceivably come back and restore the Ba'athist regime that killed tens of thousands of people, that created mass graves, and that tortured people. And he's not coming back, and that's what's changed, and it's obvious what's changed.
What about the resistance, though? Does it change that? When he was captured, there were no maps there were no phones, no communication. It's pretty obvious he was not coordinating the resistance. What does it change in terms of what is actually happening in Iraq right now? In terms of the violence, in terms of the insurgency?
Well, first of all, he was found with a sizable amount of money. And one of the things that the Saddam Hussein family and his clique of intimates were doing is they were providing money to people to go out and engage in acts against the coalition and against the Iraqi people. So that's ended, and that's a good thing. And the money is now in our hands and the hands of the coalition rather than in the hands of people whose goal is to go out and kill innocent men, women, and children. Second, the knowledge that existed with him is now no longer operational. Where money was, who was doing what, he now is out of commission, out of circulation, and that's a good thing.
Well, he has been in custody for about 30 hours now. When those pictures were taken, at the beginning, when he was being examined, he looked pretty compliant. But then some Iraqi officials got to meet with him, and they said he was defiant. What can you tell us about his demeanor, his behavior so far?
Well, I think the notable things are that he had a pistol. Here was a man who was photographed hundreds of times shooting off rifles and showing how tough he was. And in fact, he wasn't very tough. He was cowering in a hole in the ground and had a pistol and didn't use it and certainly did not put up any fight at all. I think that he resulted in the death of an awful lot of Iraqi people. And in the last analysis, he seemed not terribly brave.
Well, how...
Second, he has not been cooperative in terms of talking or anything like that. He clearly was compliant or resigned in effect as he was being examined and as he was being transferred from the hole to the transport that took him away. But I would not say that he is. I think it's a bit early to try to characterize his demeanor beyond that.
Tell us about, if you can, where he is and what conditions, under what conditions he's living. Is he in a cell? Is he in shackles? I suppose anything's better than that hole in the ground, but what can you tell us?
Well, he's obviously not been living a very good life lately. He's been spending all of his time running and hiding and moving frequently. Even during the war, we had information that he moved around Baghdad in a taxi cab, and in fact, some nights even slept in a taxi cab. So it was not a surprise to see that there was a taxi cab in the farmyard near where he was in fact captured.
Really? You think that's the one he was driving around in?
Well, I don't know that, but it's a reasonable assumption that it was at least one of the ones that he moved around in. His circumstance is that he is at an undisclosed location for obvious reasons. He is being accorded the protections of a prisoner of war, and his treatment will be governed by the Geneva Convention.
The Red Cross can come see him soon?
Those are judgments that will be made by the lawyers as we go along, but one need not worry that he'll be treated in a humane and professional way.
There have been some suggestions that he might try to bargain. In other words, he'll say, okay, I'll tell you something about weapons of mass destruction or whatever it is, the insurgency, if you will spare my life. Would we engage in a negotiation with this man?
The treatment of a person in his circumstance, it seems to me, is going to end up being discussed among the coalition and at a very high level, and lawyers will be involved, and I think it's a bit early to begin making snap decisions about what might be done. But I think that in the last analysis, here's a man who has killed so many tens of thousands of people, who will have to be held accountable and brought to justice in some form, in some way.
And you said that he would be treated as a prisoner of war, but what if...
No, yeah, he would be accorded the privileges.
Yes, that's what I meant.
And as though he were a prisoner of war, not that he necessarily is one.
Well,
and I say that advisedly.
What's the distinction?
Well, we don't know yet, but to the extent he was involved in the insurgency after the war, that a lawyer might say that he might be something either different from or in addition to. And that's why I just said he would be accorded the protections for the time being of a prisoner of war, and certainly his treatment would be governed by the Geneva Convention.
Let me ask you, raise the whole question of, for lack of a better term, torture. Let's say he's not forthcoming. Would we deprive him of sleep? Would we make it very cold where he is, or very hot? Are there any restrictions on the way we treat him to get him to cooperate more than he has been?
You know, to even raise the word torture in terms of how the United States military would treat this person, it seems to me is unfortunate. We don't torture people. And here's a man who has tortured to death tens of thousands of people, conducted rape and brutality, the likes of which it would be difficult to find a more vicious and brutal dictator who, in our adult lifetimes. And I've just told you that he would be treated according to the Geneva Conventions.
You know,
and to suggest that anyone would be engaged in torture or conduct inconsistent with the Geneva Conventions, it seems to me is not on the mark at all.
Sleep deprivation, that kind of thing. No, you're ruling it completely out, is what you're telling us.
I'm not telling you anything other than I've just told you. He will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions and given the protections of a prisoner of war.
There has been, well, it's been suggested to us that Iran may have helped in the capture of Saddam Hussein. Is that true?
No.
It's completely false. Does this...
I suppose I should always say not to my knowledge. I mean, I certainly have heard nothing that would even begin to suggest that.
Does this...
The reason he was finally captured was because some wonderful young men and women in uniform have been over there for 7 or 8 months, and they have been doing a wonderful job for our country and for the Iraqi people, in helping to set that country on a path. And they have developed an ability to deal with a high-value target like Saddam Hussein, to do it in a time-sensitive way. And when the intelligence was gathered and analyzed, brought together over a period of some hours and days, they were able to then move very rapidly and very skillfully and very professionally and capture that individual.
How would you say that the capture and where we are right now so far in the war in Iraq, or the situation in Iraq, how is that affecting the overall war on terror, and specifically, how does it relate to Osama bin Laden, if at all?
Well, if you think about it, Saddam Hussein had the aspirations of to be a leader of the entire region. He had very inflated views of himself and his role in the world. And to have him go out the way he has gone out, with a whimper, it seems to me deflates those that would have wanted to support that approach to the world. And it allows the people who believe in freedom and believe in liberty and want to have respect for the various religious and ethnic groups in that country and that region, it allows those people to be more confident about their future and more optimistic. And I think the hope that will come as a result of this is something that is not quantifiable, but I think it'll be palpable.
Did it cross your mind at all, once you heard that it was likely that they knew where he was and that he might be captured, that it would be better if he were killed? I mean, this is going to be very complicated, very drawn out, a trial. It could take years. He might cooperate, he might lie to us, who knows? Would it just be better if he, if he weren't alive?
Well, that's a fair question. You know, I have got a lot of things that I worry about and try to think through. And that was one thing that I could do nothing about. We either were going to kill him or capture him. And our policy is that we try to capture and not kill. And if we're not able to capture and we can kill, we do it. But it was something that the facts on the ground would determine, and we were prepared for it either way and had thought through what might be the appropriate circumstance in each case.
And can you tell us very quickly, because we're running out of time, what the president said when you got to tell him about this? You were the first.
Well, I called him up and I said that first reports are almost always wrong, and I don't want him to take this aboard as a fact, but that it appears that we have Saddam Hussein in custody, and our forces, the 4th Infantry Division and our Special Operations Forces up near Tikrit. And he said, well, if you're cautioning me on first reports, it must be good news, and it is good news, and that's terrific. And he asked about how we seemed to think it was Saddam Hussein, besides the fact that he looked like it. And of course, the answer was that some people put some weight in the fact that he had a bullet hole in his left leg and some tattoos. I was more interested in the fact that we found a sizable amount of money. Because we know that Saddam Hussein had doubles, and we know that they used plastic surgery. So they could very easily have put the tattoos in the bullet hole when they were doing the facial surgery. And it was the fact that he had money. And then finally, of course, it was positive identification by some members of his cabinet after we captured him.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you very, very much for being with us tonight. I know you've had a great day. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Saddam Hussein, whom American soldiers found disheveled and disoriented in that spider hole outside Tikrit, cut a very different figure from the dictator Dan Rather interviewed last February in a Baghdad palace. It was the last interview Saddam granted to an American reporter. And it started with a question that's as timely today as it was then.
Are you afraid of being killed or captured?
مناضلين مجرد مواطنين بين صفوف الشعب.
When we were young, we decided to place ourselves to the service of our people.
ما كنا آنذاك نسأل أنفسنا هل نعيش أم نموت.
We did not ask the question whether we were going to live or die. It's morally unacceptable to ask such a question. Nothing is going to change the will of God. The believer still believes that what God decides is acceptable.
We asked Professor Fuad Ajami of Johns Hopkins University and a CBS News consultant to look at other parts of that February interview. We found that many questions raised then are still unanswered today.
So, Fuad Ajami, without further ado, let's take a look at the first piece of the interview that we've selected.
أظن أمريكا تعرف والعالم يعرف الآن.
I think America and the world also knows that Iraq no longer has the weapons. And I believe the mobilization that's been done was in fact done partly to cover the huge lie that was being waged against Iraq about chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons.
Fuad, this is what Saddam Hussein said before the war.
Right.
He said, we don't have them.
Right.
Do you think now that he was speaking pretty much the truth, or was he, as is widely believed, including by myself, probably lying? And is he likely to tell us now where they are?
Well, this is the reckoning time, Dan, for this whole argument of the weapons of mass destruction as being the pretext for the war. We will now find out, won't we, if Saddam really has weapons of mass destruction. We're going to be talking to him about weapons of mass destruction, and we will be asking him whether these weapons really existed. He wanted these weapons of mass destruction. Whether he really fully was in control and fully knowing of his weapons programs, we don't know.
Let's move on and take a look at this cut from the interview.
Mr. President, have you been offered asylum anywhere? And would you, under any circumstances, consider going into exile to save your people death and destruction? Our position is basic. We have been born in Iraq. This is part of a glorious nation, a great Arab nation, and we have lived here. That is why, talking about asylum, whoever decides to forsake his nation is not true to the principles. We will die here in Iraq. We will die in this country, and we will maintain our honor, the honor that is required of our people.
That's what Saddam Hussein said 11 months ago. The fact is today he surrendered meekly, although he had both an AK-47 automatic weapon and a pistol on him. What are we to make of this meek surrender without a fight?
That this is Saddam. He talked about a heroic outcome. He wanted to write his own legend. And even his own sons and his own 14-year-old grandson last July died in a firefight. He died, he surrendered. He surrendered without a fight. So obviously it does, you can see the man's legacy and the man's legend and the man's character in a wholly different light now that we know what we know about his capture.
But not only in this interview, but in the interview in 1990 that I did with him, just after he interviewed Kuwait, he speaks of honor.
Yes.
He speaks of the Arab tradition, meaning the Arab male tradition, he meant it, of death before dishonor. What happened to that?
Well, I think there is something very interesting here. There is one part of what you ask him, and I think he can still be held to that and he would be vindicated. He did not seek asylum. He knew there was no place to run. There was no country in the world was going to have him and face the full wrath of American power. What's interesting and what's ironic and what's really the swindle of dictatorship, if you will, is that here is this man who talked about being the greatest Arab in modern time, eventually being found in a hole in the ground as like a rat.
I want to show you another piece of the interview.
Americans are very much concerned about anyone's connections to Osama bin Laden. Do you have you had any connections to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden?
هذا الموضوع لم يظهر في
We have never had any relationship with Mr. Osama bin Laden, and Iraq has never had any relationship with Al-Qaeda. And I think that Mr. bin Laden himself has recently, in one of his speeches, given such an answer, that we have no relation with him.
That is what Saddam Hussein said in late February. Do we have any more reason to believe him now than we did then? Do we have any more evidence that what he said then was untrue?
We were hit on September 11, and the trail that began in Kabul was going to take us all the way to Baghdad and all the way to that hole in Tikrit where we found Saddam Hussein. So it may be ironic for Saddam Hussein that maybe he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but he strutted around as though he did. Maybe he didn't have links with Al-Qaeda, but we were looking for these links, and we established that the one person we need to go to after the Taliban was going to be Saddam Hussein, because we needed to go to the heart of the Arab world. Our president keeps saying the heart of the Middle East about Iraq, because when we struck in Afghanistan and we struck Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, we didn't get any satisfaction. Saddam was our next target, and that's his cruel, ironic fate.
Moving along, there's this cut from the interview in February.
Mr. President, Vice President Richard Cheney of the United States says that if and when an American-led army comes into Iraq, it will be greeted with music. It will be treated as an army of liberation. If Americans are not to believe that, why should they not believe that?
لو عبر جيش العراق الأطلسي
If the Iraqi army or any other army were to cross the Atlantic and occupy America, is it going to be received by the American people with music?
لذلك لا أعتقد.
I am categorically certain that no Iraqi will welcome any American when he is an occupier.
The point is, I'm asking you to explain what you mean that you were not defeated in the 1990-91 war, because I can report to you with accuracy that overwhelmingly the American people believe that that was a resounding defeat for you and for Iraq.
في أعظم خسارة للوحدات.
We did not lose more than 10% of our equipment in all of the battles. That was the worst loss suffered by any of our units.
إذا نحن خسرنا معركة.
So, we lost a battle, but we were not defeated.
بماذا يهدد العراق أمريكا؟
In what sense does Iraq threaten America? The Iraqi people are not the enemies of the American people.
سيد راذر رجل مطلع.
Mr. Rather, you are a well-informed man, and you know the battle is not over until the guns are quiet, and when the national will is bent to what the aggressor wants.
لا يكفي.
It's not enough to have superiority in planes and missiles. In the final analysis, the guns will tell the tale of a courageous people defending themselves against the occupiers. This is a decision made by the people of Iraq. They will continue to commit themselves to the role that will make them respect themselves as well as others.
The big question, Fuad Hajami, in your opinion, what impact will the capture of Saddam Hussein have on the insurgents in Iraq, whatever their motivation, who are continuing to kill Americans and Iraqis?
Well, I love his response here, because in a way, this time at bat, it's a mixed record for Saddam Hussein, isn't it? Because Saddam Hussein said, don't expect any great welcome here. People will not be throwing flowers and roses at you. You will not be welcomed here. Well, we were welcome and we weren't. We were welcomed in the southern Iraq, where his Shia victims were glad to be rid of him. We were welcomed in northern Iraq, where, again, his Kurdish victims were glad to be rid of him. But we faced this insurgency. So in a way, he saw into that insurgency, and perhaps he prepared for it. As we now can say in retrospect, there was much preparation, not for the war. He knew he couldn't win a war, but for the insurgency, the money, the holes in the ground, the preparation in Tikrit. So in a way, he had a reading of his own country that we would be resisted. And I think as we now look and we see this insurgency that we still haven't really fully controlled and fully put down, I think some of what he said to you at that time has been vindicated.
And as for the immediate future?
Well, I believe that the way we captured Saddam Hussein and the fact that he gave up without a fight will take the oxygen out of a certain kind of resistance to the American presence. When the man himself, in this hole in the ground, gives himself up without a fight, it's very difficult to enlist jihadists, kids from Saudi Arabia and Syria and etc., who will come to Iraq ready to fight and die for the cause. Now, there are what our military, in their love of acronyms, call the FRLs, the former regime loyalists. They too, I think, will be deeply discouraged and deeply dispirited by the way he gave up. Will it be fully a panacea there? Will everything come to an end? Will all the resistance come to an end? Not quite. But I think it's a great day for us, and we have turned a corner in this battle for a decent and stable Iraq.
Before we left Saddam last February, I asked him one last question.
Mr. President, I appreciate your remembering that we met in 1990 and I interviewed you in this very building. Given the sober moment and the danger at hand, what are the chances this is the last time you and I will see each other?
Only Allah decides the fate of man. But the Almighty also says, man should prepare what is necessary here on earth. Then, I can see that in the future we will meet another time, no matter what happens or what takes place. And I hope that the Iraqi people and the American people will live in peace and have a relationship that expresses their national interests without one side harming the other.
As we looked at pictures of a disheveled, bearded Saddam being examined by an American soldier today, it seems safe to say that Saddam's stated wish about Americans and Iraqis living in peace could be one step closer to reality.
CBS News correspondent Thalia Ashuras has been covering today's dramatic story from Saddam's hometown, Tikrit, about 100 miles north of Baghdad. We'll go to her now for an update. Thalia?
Ed, it is the middle of the night here in Tikrit, here in Saddam's elaborate palace, really a stark contrast to the hole in the hovel in which Saddam was captured. This town, where so many people have been loyal to Saddam, is quiet, but military officials here say they don't know what to expect once Saddam's capture sinks in. Now, as you know, about 600 military personnel were involved in the raid, including special forces. They took 2 people along with Saddam Hussein. They have not been identified, but they are being interrogated. Saddam Hussein has also been interrogated. He's being described as uncooperative. But officials here believe that now that they have the top man in custody, the 13 remaining on America's most wanted list, well, they think that their days are numbered. Ed?
Thalia, there was no cell phone, no communications equipment. Any evidence that Saddam was coordinating insurgent attacks?
That actually is the key. Because there were no cell phones or communications equipment, the sense here is that Saddam was here for moral support, as General Odierno said earlier this afternoon, that he was unable to coordinate the efforts simply because he did not have that communications gear.
What else did they find at the compound, Thalia?
Well, at the compound, they found new T-shirts, they found socks, they found sandals. It's an indication to them that Saddam Hussein had not been in that particular area very long. It also seems to be an indication to the captors that they had been using the river, boats, to bring in supplies to Saddam Hussein, and very difficult to spot those boats.
And what can you tell us quickly about the money?
About the money, there's about $750,000. It's still being analyzed. Saddam Hussein may have provided moral support. There's some indication that he may have provided some financial support to insurgents. Ed?
Thalia Shuris in Tikrit, thank you. If ever there was a news story worth shouting extra about, it's the one all of us, including Andy Rooney, woke up to this morning.
When I was a little boy in Albany, New York, I delivered newspapers. Whenever there was a big story, like the day Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped, the newspapers rushed into print with an extra edition to tell everyone about it. There was no television news. Newspaper boys went out in the street with bundles of papers yelling, "Extra, extra, extra." I felt sorry for newspaper editors this morning. Their papers were on the street before they knew that Saddam Hussein had been captured. Not a word about it in the papers. Like most Americans, I first heard the news when I turned on the radio this morning. I went to my television set. Sure enough, there was Dan Rather, a fireman in the television news business, yelling, "Extra, extra, extra." I had 100 thoughts about Saddam Hussein while I was eating breakfast. What was his mother like? I hope we don't kill him. I hope we don't let him kill himself. He's a great source of information and such an egotistical bastard that he'll enjoy telling us everything. If you made a list of the 10 most evil men of all time, there has never been a woman so evil, Saddam Hussein would be on the list. My history isn't good enough to name all the old ones like Genghis Khan, Nero, Caligula, Attila the Hun, but we all know the modern bad guys: Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Gaddafi, Khomeini, Marcos. We congratulate ourselves all the time on our democracy here in America and for never having had a dictator. I don't know whether we've been lucky or smart. Could happen, you know. The people who follow an evil leader don't have to be evil themselves. They can be dumb, uninformed, disinterested in the world, or just too absorbed with their personal problems to care about their government. It's been amazing, really, that this great democracy of ours has lasted so long. A dictator doesn't usually just come in and take over. He moves in little by little. That's why every country, even so free and democratic a one as ours, with a nice guy as president, has to watch out. It's why some Americans, me for example, are nervous about something like the recently enacted Patriot Act. We're even nervous about saying we're nervous for fear of sounding un-American. Anyway, we've all been looking for the perfect Christmas present, and now we've got it. The capture of Saddam Hussein. It's the best gift we could possibly get, and we thank the men who gave it to us.
I'm Ed Bradley. We'll be back next week with the regular edition of 60 Minutes. Wednesday on 60 Minutes 2, she says she's Strom Thurmond's black daughter. She also says she'll tell her story just once to Dan Rather. Now, here's what else is coming up from CBS News.
On the CBS Evening News, the capture of Saddam Hussein. The ousted dictator had been on the run and in hiding for months. How did the U.S. forces finally get him? New details tomorrow, putting the pieces together. We'll give you a look at all aspects of the operation and give you the inside story. That and more on the CBS Evening News.
For news 24 hours a day, log on to cbsnews.com.
Kidnapping is dangerous.
It was supposed to be a game. She fought back.
Your girlfriend needed to get kidnapped to get excited?
But somebody changed the rules. Now to catch the killer.
He came in through here.
CSI must find all the players.
She looked him right in the eyes.
And he looked back. All new CSI Miami, CBS Monday. Tuesday, a Marine reported killed, just called his wife.
I'm not dead.
NCIS searches for the truth.
Someone wants us off this case.
All new Navy NCIS. Then, attorney Nick Fallon's girlfriend won't commit, and his past wants to come out and play.
I got a shot at tequila.
The Guardian after Navy NCIS, CBS Tuesday.
Experience CBS News.